Just going to do a little bit of musical chairs because I'm going to introduce what I'm going to term a super panel in just a moment. We've got an incredible mix of perspectives and expertise that's going to join me on stage in just a moment to talk about collaborative approaches to support the energy transition and develop renewable energy and decarbonisation opportunities. So the heart and soul of the topic today, we're going to get it from a variety of different angles. In a moment, I'm going to ask to join me on stage Rebecca Tomkinson, who's the Chief Executive Officer from the Chamber of Minerals and Energy of Western Australia, Sanjeev Gandhi, the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer from Orica, Stephen McIntosh, the Chair of Datarock, Non-Executive Director at Chalice Mining, Advisor, EMR Capital and Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and a Director of the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, ARENA. Gabby Sycamore, the Head of Strategic Services and Planning at BHP, and Lisa Zembrodt, the Principal and Senior Director at Schneider Electric. Welcome my super panel, please. What a lineup, and we don't have an enormous amount of time, so it's going to be a real challenge, but equally a great opportunity for collaboration and action, working our way through all the topics I'm excited to explore with this group of people. I think there's no better place to start than sort of the challenge that is facing us in the energy transition. We've heard a number of explorations of different parts of that agenda already on this stage today. We've heard the piece that we need more ambition. We've heard the conversation around the challenge of scale and the difficulty of the capitalisation part of that agenda. We've had a number of discussions around the need for more genuine collaboration. It's one of those things that's perhaps a little bit easier to talk about than it is to see realised, and particularly maybe that it is to see commercial alignment behind the idea of. So I'd love to throw to our panellists. I'm going to pick at random. Gabby, you're going to be my first cab off the rank on this one. Thank you for going first. What is it that you see as the challenge that we need to be leaning into?
It's something that's very near and dear to my role. I'm looking after decarbonisation for our assets across Australia, and we've done some really fantastic work with existing technology, particularly in sourcing green electricity to meet our Scope 1 and 2 abatement objectives, but now the challenge really is diesel elimination. And it's hard, and we've made it really clear that for us we will have to partner with industry and governments and communities, traditional owner groups in particular, and I think that really presents, an existential opportunity and challenge to how we think about breaking the back of it, because if we're talking about what we can achieve prior to FY30, and then we're thinking about what we can achieve on our way to net zero by 2050, it gives us a real good time frame to sort of think about how we respond to the challenges. But at the moment, there are just so many, I don't know how to pick, but I think it's working across industry to collaborate, because we don't have time to follow traditional, ways of trying to solve problems that are facing the entire industry, and mining in particular.
So need for more out-of-the-box thinking. Sanjeev, speaking of hard, you're in a hard-to-abate sector. You're thinking about that very tricky part of the challenge. You've said to me, no one has the answer, no one wants to pay, particularly either as well. Can you speak to how you would articulate the challenge from your perspective?
Yeah, it is. Any transition is challenging, this one especially so, because Orica is part of what we call the hard-to-abate, which means expensive to abate industries. We consume carbon to make a lot of valuable products that go into the resource sector, into the civil sector, into the fertilizer sector, into the food industry, the medical industry. And by definition, we are basically breaking carbon atoms, and that leads to emissions. And we are one of the 216 or 218 industries in the country, part of the safeguard mechanism, which means that there's a lot of pressure in terms of trying to reduce and eliminate our carbon footprint. Now, we've done a lot. We started on that journey around 2017, and I'm really pleased to say that using technology, and you talked about collaboration, using funding from both the federal and the state government, and bringing in state-of-the-art technology from all over the world, we will by next year have eliminated more than 1 million tons of CO2 equivalents. And not avoiding them, but eliminating them, which is obviously material for the emissions profile of this country. The challenge obviously is who's paying for this. Consumers are not willing to pay any kind of premium for a lower carbon product or solution. And this means that industries like ours, which are hard to abate, we have to find smart ways of funding this because nothing comes for free. Those technologies obviously need a lot of upfront capital and investment. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge to justify a business case. And then you have to pull resources from other priorities into decarbonization. Now, we have done our bit, but we do need help. We need help in terms of transitioning further. For example, trying to get gas, which is a feedstock for manufacturing, at reasonable costs. And the fact that we handle gas sensibly and we have abated all our emissions makes us a prime user of gas. But the struggle is, obviously, the gas mechanism in the country doesn't work. So there's a lot of challenges for industry. And we are trying to do all of this, these hard-to-abate industries, while maintaining a manufacturing base in the country, which gets more and more difficult every day.
Rebecca, I'd love to come to you next, probably from an infrastructure perspective, if we can start there, and just talking about the WA situation with regards to the common user infrastructure challenge that sits ahead of you as an industry there.
Hey Holly, how cool is the super panel? I mean, it's great to be part of this. And just to pick up on a couple of comments, Sanjeev's absolutely right. The imperative is to maintain industry in our nation and to ensure that we can meet these objectives of decarbonisation. But while we have this challenge of who pays, and while we have this challenge of still understanding the pace and sequence and the timing, we really do need to make sure that we are able to continue to have industry that's thriving and new projects coming into the Australian context. And I don't think we should underestimate what is actually at stake as we make this move towards ensuring that we meet community expectations, which we absolutely can do, but at the same time still have the very important industries, those very hard to abate industries, that we may need to make different types of approaches and arrangements with as we get to that decarbonisation piece. And Gabby's spot on. The challenge is the timing. We need to do it now, and everyone is working incredibly hard to do that as quickly as possible. We in WA have the immense privilege of being geographically rich. All of the critical minerals, as Minister Michaels mentioned in his opening address this morning, that are needed for electrification, but we are population poor. So when we look at transmission and transmission grids, we are talking big distances. So the approach for us is common use infrastructure, and anyone in industry will appreciate the significance of a statement like that for the Pilbara, particularly with organisations that have traditionally been highly competitive with each other. But we have a partnership, a MOU, where the next stage of decarbonisation for the North West Interconnected Grid is looking at how we can collaborate as organisations with government, with community, to put in place the essential transmission and infrastructure lines that are required to get the new low-carbon projects like solar and wind to market.
Great. Stephen, I welcome your thoughts on anything that's been said already, but I'd also love you to take us to the regulatory landscape, if you could, and just challenges that we need to be thinking about, maybe particularly with regards to the NEM.
Look, so I think, great context, obviously, from the previous speakers this morning, as well as on the super panel. I think Sanjeev has said it well. What we need is to green our grid, to make sure that we have affordable electricity, so that is the thing that underpins the transition, especially in our hard-to-abate areas. And the regulatory environment is incredibly complex, and so people will use quite emotive words about its function or lack of, but I tend to see it slightly differently. One of the challenges that we have is, Australia has signed up to the Paris Accord, so we have a target and a date. So we have net zero 2050, but the target and the date is not a plan. And so one of the challenges for the nation is, as we look out ahead, how do we plan to support the transition, to keep these businesses viable, and not only viable but growing, while we actually don't understand the full technology roadmap that actually gives us a firm, sustainable, clean, green, affordable, energy system. So common user infrastructure, fantastic, because we are a wealthy nation on a big continent, but with a sparse population. And so we're going to have to be really smart about how we think about that. So back to the regulatory piece, I think what I would say is the industry actually needs to spend more time with the regulators, not bashing them, trying to set out, so common user infrastructure would be a wonderful way to do it. We're going to play our part, coming together to set out a pathway forward, and hopefully that actually helps you to put the pieces in place that incentivize the right behaviours and to crowd in new funding and new innovation into our energy system.
So the goal needs to turn into more of a concrete plan by the sounds of it. And we've identified some of the things that perhaps need more attention as part of that plan. Lisa, what would you add to the mix, the conversation?
Yeah, thank you, Holly. I was just going to add, speaking about one of the challenges of the energy transition, we have a really big difference between the challenge if you're on-grid or off-grid. So WA has a very different challenge, particularly up in the north, versus what the NEM has in terms of its challenges in the energy transition. And if you think about that aim of 82% renewables by 2030 in the NEM, we're only at 38% today, right? So we've got a long way to go. And it's clear then that many energy users need to take action on their own in order to meet their objectives. And many users have an objective of 100% renewables, right? So it just highlights that there's an expectation that you'll need to do more than just what the grid is doing while also trying to support what the grid needs to do to decarbonise.
I want to come, before we talk about how we do it, how do we maintain the rage, how do we build out more of a concrete plan, maybe to some things that might add some heat to our conversation, maybe things we need to be talking a little bit more about. And I think it's important that IMARC can be a sort of a arena where we can have those conversations. Gabby, I might come to you on the comment you made in your opening remarks around the relationship with traditional owners. We're going to talk about that in detail. We've got a great panel tomorrow that will delve into that in depth. But I'd love your perspective on how do we need to be thinking about that differently? What is it going to take from the point of view of collaboration to really move forward in a different way?
It's a really interesting area, and I think really proud to be part of BHP. They've got a great reconciliation action plan that they've developed, and in there are a lot of objectives and commitments about how we're going to try and do things a little bit differently in the areas that we operate. In particular, for example, the Pilbara, where we're talking about common user infrastructure and the opportunity for a grid that might be more of a microgrid, for example, where we operate our iron ore processing hubs, is meaningful engagement. What does that really mean? And setting ourselves up to really respond to free, prior, informed consent expectations. I think some of the challenges, if we start there, is getting access to have a conversation about what can be a complex topic. I know we all love to make it more complex when we start talking about electrons, but I think taking the communities that we operate in with us, and that means allowing time in our schedule, our very ambitious schedules, to have that conversation about what role traditional owners may play. And that might be in enabling generation and storage on their country, or it might be about how we work together on transmission corridors. So I think my main piece is enabling enough time to have that conversation. It is complicated, and we're running at 1,000,000 miles an hour. But I think we have to be genuine and fair. We've put all our effort as organisations into reconciliation action plans and commitments, the principles that we operate under, the forums we participate in for First Nations clean energy, and now really it is about having a conversation about what that might look like. Now that gets uncomfortable. It starts to bring different commercial models to the table, but I think having that genuine conversation about the horizons for energy, obviously we're not boiling the ocean. How do we get there in a nice staged fashion where everyone gets a chance to participate should they should? And even down to how we design, construct and operate those facilities and the opportunities for traditional owners, because it's not the same as doing mining. It is building wind and solar and batteries and transmission. It is a different story. So I think that the ability to enable the time for that conversation is super important.
More time. I mean, Stephen links to something you said moments ago around more time with regulators too, these important stakeholders that we need to understand, they need to understand us. There needs to be a thoughtfulness around how we do that perhaps differently. I do want to tee you up on a different question though, as someone who is a former resources executive. We often sometimes hear the phrase, it's not what you want to hear, it's what you have to hear. I'd love to hear you on that particular prompt or provocation. What's a message you think the industry needs to hear at this moment in time around how we genuinely lean into collaboration and accelerate decarbonisation?
So look, I mean, I think it's interesting coming here to this show and reflecting on previous ones that I've been to. When we look out in the hall, what we see is the signal into the market to the OEMs and the vendors has been very clear. We have a lot of vendors now actually bringing the solutions to us, and they're coming fast and they're scaling fast. And you know, we can read the likes of the IEA reports that has perennially understated the penetration rate of things like solar at scale. We went from solar, we underestimated wind penetration. We've now underestimated essentially the cost out of batteries and the ability to put ever larger batteries, storage facilities, as well as obviously what are in vehicles. And so I think it's purely an ambition piece in the industry. Now, I know that's easy for me to say. I'm not in the hot seat anymore. But we've demonstrated that the solutions are coming to us faster than we would otherwise have imagined. So what we haven't done is set our shop up with the profound change management requirements to pull it as fast as it is coming to us. And remember, it's coming with amazing cost outs. You know, so we're still seeing solar, wind, batteries falling month by month in terms of delivered cost on the ground. And so simply to the resources sector, you've got to actually go even harder to be pulling it. And the harder is change management in your businesses, because the tech is actually the easy part now, in my view. You know, in particular in terms of the electrification piece. Some of the hard-to-abate sectors, clearly where we go into big users of our process heat, green iron to green steel, profoundly huge amount of work to do. But in the general electrification scheme, I think the technology stack is there. We've just got to get going.
Rebecca, can I come to you? Something we've heard consistently on the stage today is about cost curves, about affordability, and about some degree of predictability from industry, seeking that from government. I'm eager for you to tell us a little bit about the cost of electricity situation in WA. My understanding is, and you'll speak to it in more detail, but it's doubled in the last 3 years. Can you speak to us about that challenge and what needs to be, how do we navigate that? How do you lean in as industry, and what conversations are you having with government about this matter?
Well, I think, Holly, I mean, everybody in the room knows it's absolutely fundamental that affordable, reliable energy is a critical component to any industry and absolutely to any economy. So for us, you know, we're having really meaningful conversations around how we ensure we can address this a growing elephant in the room, which is no one wants to pay, yet we have to build all of these new tools and equipment and re-gear existing tools and equipment, and we need to do that at the same time. So I also think it's a really important reflection that everyone in the world is trying to do exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. And while that's an incredibly important ambition and we will globally deliver, there is going to be extraordinary cost pressure as we get to that stage. But really important that our policy settings help us to minimise that as much as we possibly can, but also to recognise that that is a real input for industry. So if you consider that the price of electricity has doubled in the last 3 years in the West Australian context, already your operating model at a time when commodity prices are being compressed is costing you more, so you are being able to not have the same return on investment as you had 3 years ago. On top of that, of course, there is the importance of delivering a decarbed product. So everyone in industry is very committed to that. We're talking about having in place roadmaps and timeframes so that we can have certainty as an industry that we will meet those objectives, because that's the other incredibly important part, that we have set targets for 2030 and 2050, and for us, the Northwest Interconnected Grid, and particularly the Southwest Interconnected Grid, many of our companies, it's integral that that decarbonises, because that helps us meet our own requirements within industry. So together we need to look at what some of the financial models are, how industry can contribute to the build, but really importantly recognising that we do need to have an affordable electric process that enables us to continue to operate.
And Lisa, on the topic of collaboration, probably the the unsexy part of the conversation is it's one of those things that's much easier to talk about than it is sometimes to do. We had Mark from Parenti on the stage earlier today, and he spoke about the idea that we need to find a way of getting our commercials to match our intent when it comes to collaboration versus the other way around, where we often end up trying to squirrel the commercials or our intent to match that commercial reality. You're a big believer that we need to find a way to compete less and collaborate more. What is it going to take to do that? What do we need to be having more of a conversation about around how we need to change our attitudes and approaches practically as leaders in industry to see that become more of a reality?
Thanks, Holly. I think one of the things that I've observed in this industry in particular is that hesitancy to collaborate, and that's understandable. A lot of what we're doing in mining is commoditized, and in Australia we have a very broad Consumer and Competition Act, right? So and it's typically risk averse, right? So it's really understandable why collaboration can be a very difficult topic in the mining industry. But there are such great benefits to be had from that collaboration in terms of being able to address the energy transition, to decarbonize. So some of the things that we need to be thinking about in terms of collaboration is how can we put in the governance structures and the transparency around those collaborations to steer clear of the Consumer and Competition Act and these types of things that create that hesitancy and that risk adversity in terms of being willing to collaborate. The second thing that comes to mind for me in terms of collaboration is, which we've touched on just briefly, is size. So a lot of smaller companies don't have the size and scale required to engage in the energy transition, to engage in a virtual power purchase agreement. The largest companies in this room do. So how can we support those smaller companies to give them access? And one of the ways is through buying groups. And that's something that I'm really keen to think about in terms of how can the larger companies enable those buying groups of smaller companies, which addresses the scope 3 of your company, which is where the emissions are concentrated.
Absolutely. Sanjeev, you're a big believer we need to be talking more about gas as a transition fuel. Can you speak more about that topic for us?
Yeah, I mean, we've heard that, I mean, if I represent manufacturing and I tell you what we experience every day, cost of electricity has gone up 3-fold, cost of gas has gone up 4-fold, labor costs are going up, productivity is down, we've got all the regulations that we have to fulfill, and we have to abate or pay penalties under the safeguard mechanism. So it's a perfect storm of challenges, and this is resulting in manufacturing in the country getting decimated. I mean, here in this city, if you go to the Botany Manufacturing Industrial Park, which was owned by Orica at one point of time, hundreds of jobs have been lost because companies like Quinnos and Indorama had to shut down during the year because they're not competitive anymore. So that's a real challenge. And when we talk about an energy transition, it's going to be bumpy, it's going to be difficult, but gas has to play a critical role here. Gas is a transition fuel. And sometimes there is this confusion that gas is bad for the environment. Now, manufacturers are not using, a lot of manufacturers like us do not use gas for electricity production. We use it as a feedstock, we use it as raw material. And from this raw material, we make a lot of important products which are important for sovereign supply chains in the country, supporting the resources, the mining sector, for example. So it's absolutely crucial that we need more supply of gas coming in. Now, that's going to take a long time. And if that's not going to happen, my expectation is that there has to be reservation of gas in country for genuine domestic users. There's no other solution, because if we don't find a solution quickly, we're going to see more job losses in manufacturing. And when we talk about future made in Australia, my point is let's first preserve the present. And if you have a base here for manufacturing, you have the skill set, you have the engineers, you can then transition into a future-facing industry. You cannot do this without having a manufacturing base in the country. And honestly, Australia has a terrible record of trying to maintain a manufacturing base. So this is extremely urgent, and we need to do something about this very quickly.
Now, I think in these conversations it's important that we spend time, particularly from a multi-stakeholder standpoint, with many different perspectives on this, talking about the state of the challenge, because I think we can't understate the complexity of what we're talking about. We've heard numerous times already today and yesterday that this challenge is only getting more complex, and it's only through having these conversations where I think we can unpack that and we can start the process of problem solving. But we can sometimes get a little bit stuck in problem glorification or admiration, as I like to call it, where we look at it and admire it from so many different angles. I do want to focus us on how can we do it? What are the points of light? What are the things that are getting us excited? What is it going to take to get it done? Stephen, I might come to you first on the funding piece, because you play a central role in the work that you do in that. As you describe it, you're sort of the enablers to help others go fast. Talk to us about that challenge. We've spoken at times about nobody wants to pay, but how do we think about the acceleration piece of emerging technology and the role of advanced technology? Can you paint us a picture of how we should be excited by that and what needs to be done to seize the opportunity there?
Yeah, look, and I think, you know, Sanjeev and Rebecca have set out the challenge extraordinarily well that the industries face. So if I was to put my arena hat on, you know, as a director of the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, you know, that agency has a significant pool of funds aimed specifically across the entire sort of value chain of the technology stack required to both decarbonise and reduce emissions. So the reducing emissions was added as a later instrument to ARENA's capability. And when we look at the sort of the history of the work that was done, the agency is 12 years young. It first focused on supporting the nascent solar industry. Before too long, as I said, manufacturing got, you know, the commoditisation of solar got it to the point where it did not require assistance in terms of, you know, some total cost of ownership or TCO gap that was sat there. So essentially the agency has moved along the value chain, if you like, not so much in wind, a lot in batteries. In the early days, it was purely grants going in to close the TCO gap, to actually have a return for those that were prepared to put money into battery capability. Then going back to that regulatory comment, once you've got the batteries on the ground, you realise actually we need services to the grid to support a grid that has ever higher rates of intermittent renewables coming in. And so frequency control became one thing. So you're working with the regulator because you need to get, you know, the participants have to be paid for it. You need to send a signal. So then the next thing is, as you moved along that tech stack, we've got things like grid forming and grid following, inverter technology sitting on batteries, because as we take spinning assets out that have inertia in the grid, we're going to need to start to replace that. So essentially, ARENA's role in grant funding sits along the technology readiness levels. So it will fund to quite high levels, you know, early R&D efforts. In the latter part, it's more about how we close that total cost of ownership gap. And so most recently, quite a lot of work going into supporting the decarbonisation of the transport sector. So it can be in charging infrastructure, it can be in the software required to actually work out how to optimise that for a business, because these are very complex assets to operate. But in particular, just straight up, the cost of early, larger 20 plus tonne BEV, battery electric vehicle trucks, was high, much higher than the ICE equivalents. And so, you know, the grants were going in to close that gap, to essentially say, we will support you to bring it in, to go through the learning, to be able to ingest it into your business. And what we see within a few years, the actual like-for-like cost from the OEMs, because they're scaling fast, is that the TCO gap keeps, you know, rapidly closes, goes to zero, and then what you do is unlock the next piece. As I said, charging infrastructures, and a lot of this is software, demand flexibility, all of those kinds of things. So there's an enormous array of things that have to be done around at the margins, as well as the big levers that Sanjeev was talking about in terms of the critical parts of policy formation.
Rebecca, I want to come to you on the challenge you identified of sort of that uncertainty and coordination between industry and government, and ask for your thoughts around how do we do it? What is it going to take to do that differently? Are there even other places in the world that you're looking at and saying if we get a little bit more of the way they work together, that'd be a great thing to bring into our system and way we do things here? But the other one I'd love to ask you about was something Richard from McKinsey spoke about earlier, the skills challenge. I know you're thinking about this on behalf of the industry. You mentioned a 63% decline in people enrolling in mining engineering earlier in his presentation. We're talking about complexity. We're already seeing that challenge show up in industry. So certainty and safety, but also that piece around the skilling challenge. How do we need to work more collaboratively, or what do industry need to do on that front?
There's a couple of key pieces that we're doing in the WA context around how do we accelerate projects coming to life, and part of that is the state has done a parallel approvals process so that we can commence alongside ensuring that we can accelerate the approvals and bring those projects. So often the approvals pathway can be prohibitive to ensuring that projects make it to fruition in time for us to be able to really utilise those resources. And at a point where we've already acknowledged it is so time critical, being able to have innovation like that in an approvals process and looking at new ways of having current activity accelerated and streamlined. The state is doing a number of activities at a state-based level. We're very keen to see the federal government adopt a similar process because obviously it's a dual process here in our nation, and it's important that we recognise what some of those barriers are so that we can address them appropriately. Industry is completely committed to strong environmental and community outcomes, but we do need to your point, we have a complex issue. We have to tackle it differently, and I think that's what everybody's saying, is we've got to come together and be prepared to look at it differently, and how can we apply ourselves. We did it in COVID. I know there's been a COVID review and then there is some feedback, so there's things we can learn about that. But we do know that we can, when we put our mind to it, accelerate the way in which we traditionally do activity. And to the second part of that, that's what we need, the brightest and the best, to provide that value proposition to help us address this biggest complexity. So in our industry, it doesn't look like it did 50 years ago, and yet still the imagery is the same. You know, I talk about an example where we used to have a kidney stone and it was abdominal surgery. Today, we go in with a laser and you're in and out in an hour. Mining is very similar. The technology that is being developed, the applications in remote mine site. We heard from Madol and an entirely digital mine site. Incredibly exciting for our young people, and we need them to be able to see the application of their skill set in being part of a solution for industry and ensuring that we are talking to what industry contributes in a day-to-day life. Everything in this room has been provided either as a raw material into a processed, industrialised activity at the end of it. And we really do need to encourage and talk to the brightest and the best coming to be a part of that.
Sanjeev, one of the things you mentioned was the challenge, but equally sort of the opportunity in manufacturing. What will it take to make Australia a powerhouse in that regard?
Well, we've got the resources. We have a terrible history of destroying manufacturing in the country. It's going to be a collaboration between industry, heavy industry, the energy providers, so it's gas and electricity, obviously skilled labour, working with the universities, working with the state and federal governments to ensure that the Australian manufacturing base first survives, thrives, and then moves into with technology, and technology is available today, and we have the resources to move into future-facing industries and build value chains in country, so we get a bigger share of the wallet rather than ship everything overseas, right? And live off that revenue. So the policy needs to be clear. Industry needs to be given confidence that this policy is here to stay. It doesn't change every 3 to 5 years, because when I invest, my assets last for 60 and 70 years. So policy certainty is absolutely critical, and we don't want the goalpost changing. Once all of that is done, industry takes the responsibility of decarbonizing, behaving responsibly, and working together with all our stakeholders, including our neighbors, including the, being responsible to the environment, and it can be done. Other economies in the world have shown that it can be done. High-tech manufacturing can come into Australia, but we need a lot of heavy lifting before we can make that dream happen.
Rebecca, I'm watching you nod. Do you want to add in?
I couldn't agree more. I think that the concerted effort, we are clever enough to do this. We have the brightest minds. We do absolutely need to ensure we maintain our manufacturing and industry base in our nation today, and that's not just going to happen by happenstance. It's going to require purposeful partnership, all of us to collaborate together, industry, government, community, to make sure we deliver those policy settings.
Gabby, can you take us into a case study in action, sort of collaboration working on decarbonisation, and talk us through BHP and what you've done from a green metals standpoint?
We're doing lots of cool stuff. I'm really pleased to be part of the team that's looking primarily at Scope 1 and 2. We do keep a close eye on what our teams are doing with green steel, and I think there's a lot of really cool stuff in the media you can have a look at to see the collaboration there. I think perhaps bringing it a bit closer to me is we're electrifying our fleets. We've done a lot of really great work to understand what the potential is for a transition to net zero, and that looks like electrification. So that changes the equipment, the heavy equipment, the trucks, the locos, the ancillary equipment. It changes the way we design, operate and maintain our mines. It touches on everything we've spoken about today in terms of the people, the operational readiness. It is amazing. But I think the BHP way has been to, kick off some pretty large-scale studies and partner with OEMs, industry and government, and have a look at how we can undertake proof of concepts. I think the mining industry has a fantastic track record of transitioning and taking on new tech, but we've also learnt that proof of concepts have got a massive role to play to make sure that we de-risk it. We've got to learn from the lessons we've learnt in the hard ways in the years gone by. So we're doing some fantastic things with battery electric trucks, for example, and battery electric locos. So we will have 2 Wabtec and 2 Progress Rail battery electric locos arriving in the coming year that will enable us to test and trial whether that technology is fit for purpose for a mining operation. We've got our Caterpillar Early Learner 793 truck that's getting assembled in Perth at the moment that will be going to site shortly. That is a collaboration with Caterpillar, and we're also going to be sharing and doing the trial with Rio Tinto. So again, industry first, where we are partnering with others to be smarter about this. We don't have time for all of us to learn and take our learnings and optimise them. We've got to really do it together. And I think I heard yesterday that on average, new technology takes 12 to 16 years to really come to the fore and be adapted, and we just don't have that time. So are there ways we can think about how we partner, share learnings, and give the right signals to market so that they can accelerate their prototypes as well, but equally testing it in our own backyard? We can do a lot of technology trials in North America, for example, but being able to bring those trials and do them in the West, how amazing. The hearts and minds, the opportunity for the regulators to get involved, lots of great ways we can do things a bit differently. So we are trying our best to do the methodical, orderly studies to make sure we're making smart decisions. We've got to keep people safe. The introduction of these massive batteries is a whole new world, but we can do it smarter if we're doing it together. So lots of collaboration with OEMs. We're partnering with people like Southwest Research Institute who do some fantastic battery testing at scale. There's lots of things happening in adjacent industries. We're not an island. So in all of that, I hopefully given you a bit of context, but it's really a case of methodically working with others to de-risk, get smarter, but importantly accelerate. We don't all have to learn individually, we can learn together.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear that comment on we do not have the time to learn individually either. So we need to have more generosity of sharing learnings and equal more collaboration in those learnings and proof of concepts that you talked about being so critical in that process. Lisa, you're also a big believer that we need to think about how we're reporting and telling the story differently. Can you speak about the critical role that plays? Because it gets a little bit to what Rebecca was saying earlier, like there's a story we're still telling of the industry that we need to change, and equally there's an accountability that comes with reporting differently. So how do we need to think about that?
Yeah, so I'm sure everyone's heard by now that the Australian government has legislated climate-related financial disclosures. There are personal liabilities for directors under that legislation, and so making sure that you've got the right data and good data is really important. So that's a critical capability for the future, is those data platforms to be able to collect, clean and report on the appropriate data, and in a way that you're not bogging down teams, not just internally to your own business, but across your supply chain, because you will need to be collecting data from your supply chain as well as your Scope 3 data matures. But one of the things that I wanted to point out about the mandatory disclosures is that they are so critical for ensuring a company deeply understands the connection between climate risks and opportunities and financial viability and stability of a business. And by creating that understanding and acting on the understanding of climate and financial outcomes, that's a very powerful thing. So that's incredibly important when we think about how will we collaborate in the future, because once we've disclosed all these things that perhaps aren't being disclosed today, we will gain visibility and transparency to each other. And that's likely to drive some additional collaboration in our supply chains and our ecosystems.
Also think about transparency. There was a comment in the panel just before this one where it was projects move at the pace of trust. And I just think about the role of transparency in trust building and creating a foundation that can lead to the sort of collaboration that Gabby described a moment ago, where you're leaning into learning and sharing lessons together and equally having a go at bringing projects to life. Our super panel time has almost drawn to a close, so I'm going to give each of my panellists just an opportunity to give a final takeaway for the leaders in the room. And I'd love that to be around the how, whether that's a thing to go and do, a question to go and ask, an experiment to go and run in your organisation. How do we focus on how to move forward on collaboration and drive more of it after being here at IMARC? Lisa, I might start off with you and work our way down. Keep our answers short if we can, because our time is rapidly expiring.
Mandatory disclosures are the story that you're telling of what you're doing. So keep your focus on what you're doing and tell the story second.
Great. Punchy, well, like role modelled. That was beautiful. Gabby.
I don't know how to answer this succinctly, but I think maybe touching on where I started, which is recognising that to really get the collaboration, we have to bring others on the journey with us in hearts and minds. Otherwise, I think we're going to be learning the same lessons over and over again.
All right, mandatory disclosures, bring others with us. Stephen?
And I think, as Gabby said, I would reiterate that one point, that we don't all need to run the same proof of concept. So this is the time where the industry absolutely has to come together and parcel out all of that work, and so that we can collaborate, we can build these networks and move quickly.
Great. Sanjeev?
Second that, let's stop pointing fingers at each other. Let's try and find a way to work together to get that vision going.
Fantastic. Rebecca?
It's a shared problem, Holly. I think we just need to continue to educate that we don't save the climate by not having industry in our nation. Indeed, we accelerate the problem.
Can you join me in thanking our panel for a tour de force of collaboration, how we can mobilise it for the energy transition, accelerate it, the state of the challenge, but also things that should give us great optimism about our ability to meet that challenge. Rebecca, Sanjeev, Stephen, Gabby and Lisa, thank you so much for being here with us. Can you join me in thanking our panel?
Thank you, Holly.